Hola, quisiera invitarlos a esta entrevista que vamos a tener con Jarrett Walker. Esta entrevista se enmarca dentro de la conferencia que organizamos el Centro de Desarrollo Urbano Sustentable Cedeus, el Centro de Conflicto y Cohesión Social COES, que lamentablemente tuvimos que cancelar por los tremendos eventos que hemos tenido de protesta y conflicto en Santiago y en otras ciudades del país en octubre de este año 2019. Pero afortunadamente tenemos la oportunidad de que Jarrett haya venido a Chile de igual forma y nos ha permitido poder tener algunas conversaciones interesantes y significativas como esperamos que sea esta. Mi nombre es Juan Carlos Muñoz, soy el director del Centro de Desarrollo Urbano Sustentable y Jarrett es un muy prestigioso consultor en materia de diseño de redes de transporte público con un foco muy fuerte en la accesibilidad y la libertad para las personas de las distintas ciudades. Y él es muy prestigioso también porque ha escrito un famoso libro que se llama Human Transit, que habla de lo importante de un transporte público diseñado para el humano y con consideraciones sociales y técnicas. Mucho gusto de tenerte, Jarrett. Muchas gracias por venir y por tener el tiempo para estar con nosotros aún en estas difíciles circunstancias. La entrevista va a ser en inglés porque ese es el idioma en que Jarrett se siente más cómodo. Los subtítulos van a ir aquí abajo. So Jarrett, you're an expert in public transport network design. You have experience all around the world. I would like to ask you if you could share for us what would be the more relevant elements that you consider that when you have the challenge of this redesigning a public transport network that would be attractive or interesting for us to think in Latin America.
Too often we don't have a clear conversation about what our goals are for public transport and about how those goals are tied to what kind of city we really want and what our values are as a community and as a country. So it's normal, for example, to have a technical process in which we try to measure how a project will change certain travel times and therefore predict what people will do in response to some sort of project. And a thing that I have begun thinking about this is that we are not necessarily very good at predicting what people will do. And that when we predict what people will do, that's almost the opposite of caring about their freedom to do whatever they want to do. After all, if you do only things that I as an expert predict that you will do, you're not really free. So I think it's become important to measure freedom in addition to whatever predictions we try to make, and to say what matters is what people can do, where they could go, and therefore what they could do in their lives. That means, so when you think about a person in a particular place, and we think about that area that they could get to in a reasonable amount of time, say 45 minutes, that area is, if you will, a wall around your life, beyond which there are all kinds of things that you can't do, jobs you can't hold, schools you can't go to, social opportunities you can't pursue, places you can't worship, a whole world of things you can't do. And so if we can expand that wall, and we can measure how we've expanded that wall, we've done two important things. First of all, the usefulness, the ridership of public transit tends to go up when we expand that wall because we've made it useful to more people in more situations. But also, the liberty itself is a good thing. Think about the ways that we talk about inequality, and inequality contains the important problem of immobility. It is not just that people are poor, it is that they cannot get to opportunities. So when we measure liberty, we're measuring, I think, an important thing to care about, especially in a society that is concerned about inequality and is concerned about access to opportunity. So it's not a question of exactly what we should do so much as what we should measure, because what we measure will determine what we decide is success.
I see. And in this issue, it's important how to incorporate, I think, equity.
Right.
In the previous weeks, we've seen all this social unrest because a lot of people are claiming that the way we built our society, it's very segregated and unequal.
Right.
Where some people have a lot of access to a lot of opportunities, some other people don't. Where people have great transport opportunities, some people have very lousy ones. So I wonder how would you how can we incorporate equity in this process of design of transport systems? And of course, that would mean giving more priority for those projects that will involve poor people or will improve their conditions better. If we were to do that, what kind of project would we start doing, and what kind of project we would not start doing if we take equity into the consideration?
So the question when we think about inequality is what exactly are we trying to distribute equitably? And I suggest that when we think about inequality, it's very helpful to remind ourselves that the problem that transport solves is immobility. The problem that transport solves is that people cannot access opportunity because they cannot get to that opportunity because the transport system doesn't do that for them. We all experience that. Even if we drive cars, we experience that in the form of traffic congestion, where we decide sometimes, I imagine almost everyone watching this has had the experience of deciding not to do something because the transport problem is just too difficult. It is just too hard to go there. So you don't do something, so you experience a lack of opportunity. If what we distribute is opportunity, if what we distribute is liberty, if what we distribute is the ability to go more places so you can do more things, that is, I think, foundational to what a meaningful concept of equity will include. It's easy on the surface to say that equity is simply about some people have too much money and some people don't have enough. But a broad consensus around what to do about inequality has to consider that it's not just about resources, it's also about opportunity. And even my most conservative, the most conservative people I know need to believe, want to believe that everybody can work hard and access opportunity. And where we are now is a reality where that is no longer true and people no longer believe that. And when we think about immobility and the problem of immobility, we are attacking exactly that problem.
And regarding citizen participation, too often it is claimed that the transport system is designed and implemented in a way that is built within four walls by technocrats, people, and users, and people, regular people in the city are left out of this decision. Can you elaborate a little bit on how cities like Santiago should evolve if we were interested in incorporating citizen participation in a more real and more active way in our processes?
Right. Understandably, as in many countries, you have a history in which most people perceive that authorities are simply not listening to them. And it is easy to say, and it is important to say, that you need to have a process in which everyone feels they can participate and everyone feels they can express a view and talk about their needs and hopes for the system. The difficult part of citizen participation is that the input from hundreds of thousands of people telling us what they need doesn't necessarily tell us as planners what to do in the context of our situation. We have to answer particular questions about the design of public transport networks. So what I believe very strongly is that we have to ask the public specific questions. Should we do this or should we do that? Should the goal be this or should the goal be that? Rather than simply asking the public to tell us whatever they think or whatever they feel, we need their help to know what we should do. But to get that help, we need to ask the public to answer our question so that they tell us what to do in the context of our actual situation as planners. So this is one of the main things that I've been innovating as a consultant for the last 10 years, is I've been trying to change the public conversation into one where people are asked to answer certain questions, and in return for answering those questions, they will give us answers that we can actually implement. Right? So it's easy to tell us, for example, that you don't like to transfer or you don't want to walk here or whatever, but what we really need to know is what choice would you make when we have to choose between this and that? What we really need to know is we have to make this kind of decision in the context of a transport plan. How would you make that decision if you were in our place? That, in our experience, creates a public participation process in which the citizen feels empowered because they can see how, by answering our question, they will directly influence our work.
Now, in this case, if you're asking people to answer your questions, some people may say, well, we would like to also make our own question, like bring our own
Exactly.
considerations that may not be framed in your questions. How can in your citizen participation process can one allow them to come with new solutions that you didn't think of?
Right.
Second, to incorporate their local knowledge about the reality which you don't really have.
So we are always listening for that. We are always listening for new ideas. We are always listening for important themes that may lie outside of the questions we asked. We are not deaf to that. However, the interesting thing about transport planning is that it is both about personal experience and how people feel and what threats and pleasures they experience in the course of trying to navigate the city. And everyone has their own story and their own experience about that, and it is great to hear those stories and to draw themes out of it. But on the other hand, public transport is about movement through space, and there are facts about physical space, and those facts are geometric facts. Geometry is the study of physical space and how it works. So there are realities, for example, about how many different things can fit through a street. And the fact that you emotionally like driving your car down this street doesn't change the fact that there is only room for a certain number of cars. Not everyone can do that just because they want to. So there are questions that have to be asked. An excellent question to ask the public is not just, do you want to drive your car down this street or do you want to ride your bicycle down this street? It is, here is the width of the street. We have 15 meters here. How would you divide it up? Because that is the actual question we have to answer as planners. And if people will think about that question as in the form that we ask it, they can give us feedback that will actually tell us what to do in the actual situation.
Following this last idea, how would be your recommendations on how people in Santiago or authorities in Santiago should distribute road space? We have need for pedestrians and for urban encounter of people. We need bike lanes. We need public transport as buses or light rail train. We need some room for cars. How would you solve this balance in a way that the streets are a place that serve the sustainability and efficiency of the city?
I think we have to start always with the geometric fact. The definition of a city is a lot of people in not much space. And that means the definition of the city is that there is not much space per person, which means that the problem of the city, the biggest problem of transport, is how to share space in a way that is just and equitable. And this is just like teaching our children how to share their toys. We all grow up learning about sharing and learning about the fact that sometimes there isn't a toy for every child, and so they have to share their toys. It's just like that in a street, and it's the same moral question. So again, we have to talk about how we share the street so that as many people as possible experience as much liberty as possible. And that simply doesn't work if most of the street is occupied by cars, because cars take so much space to carry so few people that they cannot possibly be the answer in creating a street where everyone can move and where people can move using so little space that there's enough space for everyone. That's why, ultimately, a good urban street network contains a network of public transport lanes that protect public transport from traffic so that public transport can move reliably enough and quickly enough that it becomes a logical choice for people and becomes a tool for liberty, and also needs to include a lane for person-sized vehicles. Bicycles are the most common example right now, but others are being invented. Ways to travel without using much more space than your body takes. Because those are the critical tools for using the scarce space as efficiently as possible. There can still be lanes for cars, there can still be a role for cars, but there cannot possibly be enough space for everyone who would like to drive down the street. That's just a fact of what a city is. So if we start with the geometric fact, we can drain a lot of anger out of these issues. If we bring people to recognize that we are in physical space together and there is only so much space, and the question is how we will share it. And once we're talking about how we share something, then we can have a good conversation about what are the rules for sharing. The rule we have now that we've evolved in the context of the car culture is simply that because it is so easy for a car to threaten other people because it's so easy, regardless of the intention of the driver, for a car to be a threat to a cyclist or a pedestrian. Cars tend to get all the space. And we define traffic safety in terms of everyone else getting out of the way of cars because cars could hurt them. So that's, if you think about it, it's a kind of law of the jungle where physical force and physical danger, which causes cyclists and pedestrians to stay out of the way and therefore experience less liberty, is the way we do it right now. But is that how you want to do it? Is that the fair and just and equitable way to distribute space? Is it even the way to distribute space that is best for your economy if you're thinking purely in terms of prosperity, let alone if you're thinking in terms of equity?
What's your reaction to urban freeways in cities? Should we consider urban freeways?
The purpose, there's a huge difference between orbital freeways, which help traffic avoid the city, and radial freeways, which put traffic into the city. Almost nobody is building radial freeways anymore. And the reason is that radial freeways put traffic into the city street network at a faster rate than the city street network can absorb that traffic. So it simply doesn't work. It's a way of moving congestion from it's a way of moving a traffic jam from one place to another, and it tends to encourage traffic jams inside of the city. As you get closer to the center of the city and things get denser, that means there is less space per person, and that means that cars become less and less useful. So very important to have freeways that help people avoid the city as motorists, as truckers, if they don't want to be in the city. Very important that they be able to go around the city and access various destinations on the edge. But it makes no sense at all geometrically. It's not a cultural question. It makes no sense geometrically to be encouraging more cars to come into the center of the city.
Let's talk about buses. In Chile, as in many other cities, we have relied bus provision to private companies, building this sort of public-private partnership in which we need to align very carefully the goal of the interest of the social interest with the goals of the companies. But however, in the developed world, very often bus companies are not really provided by the government, by private companies, but by the state. Right. How do you feel about relying the operation in either the state or private companies?
It always makes sense that this starts with private companies. When you're a very small city and most people are driving around in cars, it makes sense that the government isn't very interested and that they're happy to just make a deal with a private company or even let it run for profit. As the city gets bigger and denser, I'm not just talking about Santiago, I'm even talking about something the size of Temuco or Antofagasta. As a city gets denser, it becomes important for the city that public transport succeed. And that changes the calculation, because now it is not simply a competitive business like any other. It's an urgent element of how the city defends itself and how the city cares for itself. That is the point at which government must begin to take the lead, when that interest appears. Now, at that point, the question is, what is the appropriate division of labor between government and the operating companies? And what many other countries have discovered, and I have worked on this very transition in Australia, in New Zealand, in Ireland, in Canada, in many other countries, is that there is an excellent role for private operating companies in actually driving and maintaining the buses. But that government must have the power to actually design the routes, to design the network, and to plan, for example, the information system so that people can navigate the entire network regardless of which operating company is driving a particular bus. That also means a different deal between the government and the companies. The way it has typically worked is that the companies collect their own fares and keep it, and that forms their profit. The way it needs to work, if you're going to have a complete connected network, is that the government hires the companies strictly to run the buses. And the government pays the companies to do that, and so the companies are not as focused on just grabbing ridership for themselves. This is important because only when we remove that incentive does it make sense for the companies to work with the government on being part of a network where everything works together. A great example is fare penalties for transferring. If If when you transfer, you have to pay another fare, we are discouraging people from changing from one bus to another. And that makes no sense, because when people transfer, they actually make it possible for us to design a more efficient network that expands everyone's liberty. It makes no sense for us to charge people to do something that we actually want them to do and want to encourage.
Good. Regarding how to pay and align the incentives between the private operator and the government and the social interest, you mentioned that we should focus on paying them for moving the buses more than for being looking for gathering or attracting more ridership. In Chile, some people have argued that we should be doing the opposite, that we should be paying bus operators depending on how many passengers they attract. Why would that be a bad idea?
Because the usefulness of because ridership of public transport arises from public transport being useful. And the first element of public transport being useful is the design of the network, the routes and frequencies, and very importantly, how the whole network fits together regardless of who operates it. And it is not fair to an operator to tell them, we are going to pay you based on your ridership, but meanwhile we just want you to run these routes, and those actually won't give you very much ridership. We may want you to run those routes because they're part of a total network that will do everything we want to do. So it's when government has to assert control over planning in order to create a full connected network, it then makes sense that government, rather than the operator, bear the primary risk about ridership. Now, there are roles in many of the deals that I've worked on. There is still, in the operator's compensation, a small factor that depends on ridership. It's maybe 10% of the total compensation for the operator. And that way, the operator does have some motive to treat their riders well, and to provide good service, to hire friendly drivers, to maintain the buses so that they're nice to ride, all those things. But that factor is limited because those kinds of activities aren't the dominant thing that generates ridership. The dominant thing that generates ridership is the design of the network, the routes, the frequencies, the connections, and all of that, which the government understandably has to control.
What's your opinion on subsidies for public transport? In Chile, we have incorporated very important subsidies for public transport. And if you look at the developed countries, they usually have subsidies that are pretty high in terms of their operational costs. And that, of course, affects fares. What's your perspective on how much should we devote for public transport in terms of subsidies? What's the reason for that? Is it an issue of just of equity or of efficiency? And how much this should be on the operational cost?
In very poor countries, it is not hard for public transport to be profitable, because the expectations of the citizens are very low, and most importantly, labor is extremely cheap. Operating cost for public transport is dominated by the cost of labor. So as you become a wealthier country, and particularly as wages go up and salaries go up, public transport becomes more expensive to operate. That's why, as a country gets wealthier, it needs to subsidize public transport more and more, because although it becomes more expensive to operate, it doesn't become any less critical to the life of the city. So yes, it's normal that if you look at Europe, you will see very high levels of public subsidy for public transport, which is completely understandable because they see public transport as a critical utility, just like water and electricity and anything else. It's something that has to exist. And when something has to exist and has to function for everyone, it doesn't make sense for it to be a purely profit-based enterprise. It's not trying to make money. It may very well need a lot of subsidy, but it's a critical part of infrastructure, just as the streets themselves are.
All right. Final question. I would like to take you into land use planning. The quality of service that citizens receive in terms of their public transport depends not only on how fast the vehicles will be moving, but also on how the city is structured.
Right.
We have a very lousy, I think, urban planning system in Chile, in which the cities are mostly evolved depending on private initiatives. I would like you to tell us about, if you could share with us some good examples on how this is done in some other cities in which you think tend to lead the cities towards more sustainability and efficiency?
It's normal that your first reaction when you have a transport problem is to blame Transantiago or to blame a transport authority. It's normal to believe that the transport authority controls transport. But we have to remember that the people who develop land, the people who decide where people will live, where people will work, who decide where the residential zones will be and where the industrial zones will be and how dense they will be, they are the people who create the transport problem. Because they decide frequently, for example, that we will build a great mass of towers far, far out from the city because the land is cheaper there and therefore it's cheaper for us to do that. Good for the developer. But what they've done is create a massive transport problem because now the people who will live out there have to travel further. We have to put the responsibility for that problem where it belongs, which is on the process of land development and on the decisions about where things are built, because that's where the problem is created. Now, many jurisdictions have, around the world, have come up with laws and structures that put some sort of control on that. I'll tell you the story of the place where I live, which is the state of Oregon in the United States. Back in 1972, partly because we were concerned about preserving farmland, we established a set of laws that create urban growth boundaries around every city. That means there's a very hard boundary, and we say we will grow the city inside of that boundary, but we will not do urban development beyond it. That has the effect of requiring urban development to be more dense. It stops the common problem that a developer ignores spare land inside the city and chooses to build out in the country just because that's easier or cheaper for them. It says, no, you have to build inside the existing area. The other thing it has done is to preserve valuable agricultural land that is very, very close to the city. For example, we have a vast wine industry that has of beautiful vineyards that people love to visit. And all of that has developed on land that we would have paved over if we had not had these laws. So that's the kind of, and of course, certainly if you look at Europe, you will see very, very strong land use controls. Probably the extreme of a country like the Netherlands, which has always known that it has very little space and has always known that it can't waste space at all. It's easier in a country like Chile to look around Santiago and say, oh, there's so much space out there, there's so much land out there. We don't have to care about how we use it, and which has been very much the attitude across much of the United States as well. But you have to remember, you're creating transport problems based on where you choose to put things, and there have to be consequences for that.
Finally, my bike friends would not forgive me if I don't ask you about bikes. What's the role you feel that we should be devoting for bikes? Should we build infrastructure for bikes? What are your expectations on the role that a bike will play in a city?
Public transport and bicycling, or more broadly, person-sized vehicles, which could include scooters or other things that get invented that are at about that size and go about that speed. They are the best of friends. They have to work together because they have different roles. The overwhelming majority of bicycle trips are fairly short. Even in the Netherlands, which is world famous for cycling, 90% of bicycle trips are less than 2 kilometers. So for most people, cycling is a way you go a short distance. Public transport has a great deal of difficulty being useful for a trip under 2 kilometers. And the reason for that is that for a trip that's that short, the weight becomes a big part of the trip. And it's very hard to run so much frequency that a bus is always coming soon enough when you're going only such a short distance. So it makes all the sense in the world to have excellent infrastructures and lots of different ways for people to travel less than 2 kilometers. And what that does, it allows public transport to specialize more on the longer trip. It means, for example, we can move stops a bit further apart so that we operate a little faster, so that because we're concentrating on being useful for a longer trip that's going to benefit more from that. It's a perfect marriage if we get them together, and that's why a successful city has a public transport, a network of protected public transport lanes, and a network of protected lanes for bicycles or other person-sized vehicles. They all work together, and they all have to fit into the street.
Thank you very much, Jarrett.
A pleasure.
Termina esta buena entrevista. Hemos recibido un montón de comentarios, opiniones, muy sabios comentarios y conocimiento que creo que debería ser extremadamente útil para nuestras ciudades en términos de poder lograr que evolucionen de una manera más sustentable, más eficiente y que fomenten ciudades menos conflictivas y más cohesionadas. Muchas gracias y nos vemos en una próxima entrevista.
Muchas gracias.